Hi, this is Charles Kelly. Many of you know from my podcasts and blogs that I'm a buy-to-let investor. I've been investing in property perhaps since about the 1980s, so quite a while. And like most people, you always feel that you can have a choice over what type of tenants you want to take. Do you want tenants who are on benefits, or do you want to say, well, I don't want tenants on benefits? And I think most landlords would feel that they could say, I would prefer no benefit tenants, or you can say no DSS. On ads, you can tick whether you accept DSS ads or tenants or not, like on spare room, for instance. But now a district court judge, a county court judge, has ruled that a blanket ban on DSS tenants has been ruled unlawful. In other words, DSS is another word for saying somebody who's on benefits or on universal credit, as it's called now. DSS, I think, stands for the Department of Social Security, so it was like a nickname for benefit tenants, but it's somebody who's on housing benefit, which has now been replaced by universal credit. And you may start asking, well, is it still worth investing in buy-to-let property? We've been hit by higher taxes, the removal of tax relief, more legislation, more local authorities introducing licensing across all buy-to-let properties, different rules coming in for things like HMOs. And just generally more rate tax. So you might ask, is it still worth it investing in buy-to-let property? Now, I'll just come back to that in a second. But the judge's rule basically that having a blanket ban on renting properties to people on housing benefits are unlawful and discriminatory. We always have this word discriminatory, or rights and that sort of thing, don't we? And it's been described as a momentous court ruling by organisations like Shelter. They found that a single mother of two had experienced indirect discrimination when a letting agent refused to rent to her. So I guess this is against a letting agent who said no DSS, because many letting agents don't want to deal with DSS benefit tenants. It can be a lot more hassle dealing with claims, deposits and that sort of thing, and it can be more difficult. And they've just said it's discriminatory, and she ended up homeless with her two children. They make it sound like it's the landlord's fault that she ended up homeless. She ended up homeless for other reasons. I mean, where's her partner, for instance? Where's the partner involved in this? She's obviously ended up homeless for a reason. And now this housing charity took out an action on her behalf, a housing charity called Shelter. Why didn't they house her? Shelter. Now, this judge said that a blanket ban are against the equality laws. And the name of this judge is Judge Victoria Mark. Heard that this is in York County Court in July, ruled that, and I'll read this out, rejecting tenancy applications because the applicant is in receipt of housing benefits was unlawfully discriminating on the grounds of sex and disability. I don't know how sex and disability comes into this, and contrary to the Equality Act 2010, she said. So, okay, that's the ruling. Now, people obviously deserve a place to live, but does it mean people have got the right to live? Does it mean that you've just because you're in this country you have a right to this and a right to that? Well, I don't think so. I think we have certain rights, to liberty, to our safety, and to to be in this country alone is actually, I would say, a privilege rather than a right. And I'm privileged to be born in the country. So, but as we're saying, I've got a right, or I've got a right to a job, I've got a right to this, or I've got a right to that. Well, I've never felt that way. I've always felt that I've got my freedom, and I've got free education, I've got free healthcare. And I've got a right to and the freedom to go out and work and earn money and do what I can for my family, or to improve society, or just to improve myself, and that's what I try and do. But more and more people seem to feel that that they have a right, and that the world owes them a living. And that's the kind of rhetoric we hear all the time here. So, I think having been deserving to have somewhere to live is one thing, but having a right to say, well, I've got a right to rent your property even though I'm on benefits. I think landlords also need to be able to choose to whom they want to take on as a tenant. Now, I'm not saying I don't rent to people on benefits. I've had both, and at the moment I've got a mixture. But I've had mixed results. I've had bad benefit tenants. I've had bad private tenants. But definitely benefit tenants are more of a challenge, and it can be a very steep learning curve for landlords. I mean, for instance, you could have a claim that's ticking over, and the council are paying this person's rent, and then it can just suddenly stop. The council can dispute their claim. Councils can claw back money from landlords and accuse the landlord of defrauding them, just because they've been paying out this rent, and then it turns out that the tenant was not entitled to those benefits, and that they accuse the landlord of defrauding, and they can claw back money. I've had cases where the rent's been ticking over very nicely, and then the couple split up, and you hear, like, my boyfriend hit me, he's in jail, they've stopped my claim, and they just sit there and say, well, I haven't got my claim stopped. And then what are you going to do about it? Then you have to go through either getting it sorted out for them, or evicting them, which is another problem. And then the council, well, you've made them homeless. What can a private landlord do? There's got to be some reasonableness here, and it's ridiculous to say, well, you have to take those tenants, because a lot of landlords might say, well, I don't want that kind of hassle. I just want a private tenant who can just go in and pay me, and pay the deposit up front, and pay the rent up front, and that's it. Now, there's also another issue, and that the rates paid to landlords, and these are called the LHA rates, local authority housing rates, are just simply not competitive in some areas. For instance, around the London area, for instance, they're not even equivalent to the open market rate. So why should a landlord be forced to take somebody, for instance, if you've got a house in this area, and you could rent it out for £1,600 a month, well, the LHA rate might only be £1,450. So landlords will say, well, why should I suffer that? Why can't you pay the going rate? And many landlords have to then collect a top-up payment from the tenant, which is another issue. So that's another thing. And then the councils themselves discriminate against people, because they say if you're under 35 you'll get a much lower rate. I think it's nearly half the rate that you can get if you're over 35. Well, that's discriminatory, isn't it? That's age discrimination. I don't know how they get away with it. Now, and also there's another issue. The private sector, again, has been asked to pick up the pieces for the failures of successive governments. I'm not talking about Labour, Conservatives, I'm talking about governments since the 1970s who have failed to build enough social housing. Now, I go back a few years, and I remember the last sort of major council estates I saw being built were in the 1970s. And that was in London when I lived in North London. And I remember seeing an estate going up in Kilburn, actually. And since then, I didn't see any major. I saw some places being knocked down and maybe build more, another estate on an existing old site that had to be knocked down. But usually it ends up in less flats and less accommodation. But I haven't seen any major building program for social housing since the 1970s. And I think it was the Cameron government said they needed to build 7 new towns in the southeast of England. 7. How many new towns have actually been built? Well, as far as I can see, maybe 1, Ibsfleet or something like that. Nobody probably knows where it is. It's somewhere on the way to the Channel Tunnel. But there hasn't been this building programme. And can you tell me when the last major town was built, or which was the last major town built around proper infrastructure, where they had a rail link and they built infrastructure around it, they built proper infrastructure and jobs program. They had a jobs program in mind so that people in that town, large town, would be able to live and work there without having to travel or commute anywhere. Can you tell me what that town was? I'll tell you what it is. This is, now correct me if I'm wrong here, Milton Keynes. Now Milton Keynes has been very, very successful. It has a population, I think, of over 200,000 now. It's on a rail link going north from Euston, and it goes down south to Euston and north up to the northwest. It's on the M1. It's on the A41. It's a proper place in the central place where it benefits from a great location. I think Amazon are there and all sorts of companies are there. It's got a university there, the Open University, and other colleges, and it's a really successful place. But that was built, I know it was planned along with other major new towns, was planned in the 1960s. So this is, you're going back like 60, 70 years here as to when these new towns were planned. And since then, we've had virtually nothing. We've had a few garden villages here and there, and all we seem to do is build piecemeal on existing conurbations. Like we say, right, you've got a town here, we're going to build another bit on this section where there were fields and grass, and we're going to build a bit here and a bit there. And all they're doing is packing more cars onto the road because there's no transport links with many of these places, and buses have become they're not used anymore, so they gradually get phased out. So it's just putting more cars on the road, and then they say, well, there's too many cars on the road, we're going to start taxing you, we're going to start bringing in congestion charges and this sort of thing. And so it just gets worse and worse. We need proper new towns, we need proper new cities actually, and there's loads of spaces available. You go to Bedfordshire, there's just empty space everywhere. You can easily build places in Bedfordshire on an existing rail line. I was a councillor in a council as a planning a committee member, and I used to say, why can't we build these things on a rail link? So if you've got two stations in between each other, so you've got St Albans and Luton, and there's a gap in between, why can't you build a place around that on that line? So you don't even have to build a new line. And they said, well, it's very expensive. It costs about 10 million. We can't possibly afford that sort of money. I don't know why it costs 10 million to put a couple of platforms of concrete and a few huts and a car park. I don't know how that's cost 10 million, but that's what they said. Also, the other thing they said is, well, if we give people council houses, then they might buy them in the future. I said, well, so what if they buy it? What's the difference about it? You've still got somebody in a house. You've still got somebody housed, and they're not stuck in a hotel bed and breakfast on temporary accommodation. You still put them in a house. What does it matter if they buy them? And even if they buy them, most people couldn't even buy them anyway, because if you're a council tenant, how can you in the London and the South East buy a house that's worth 500,000? They said, well, you get a discount. I said, but not. They didn't even know what the discount was. I said, the discount wouldn't be enough to help them to afford to buy the house. If they could afford to buy that house, they shouldn't be in council accommodation. Now, councils can actually borrow money at very low rates. I think 2-3%. They can borrow long term at these rates, and they could build more social housing, proper social housing, not shared accommodation that's given away by a private developer. They could build proper social housing, and they could really do something to change the country and solve the housing crisis. So I think they've got to really get their act together and do that, and not worry if people are going to buy it in the future. So what? Let them bloody buy it. Then you build some more. You can borrow this money at very low rates. The rent would easily cover the repayments on the loans. I just cannot understand why they just don't do it. And it's not just one council, there's lots and lots of councils just not building enough. So what I would say here is, on this ruling, I'm not even sure that a ruling by a district judge in a county court is binding in law across the board. But if it is binding, it's just going to be more red tape and costs and legislation for landlords, many of whom feel they're already swimming against the tide. Don't forget, we've lost tax relief on mortgage interest, we've lost other reliefs. We're all paying more tax now than we were, thanks to George Osborne, George Six Jobs Osborne, who's brought these rules in while he's got his money offshore, apparently. So we feel like we're swimming against the tide. So is it worth investing in buy-to-let? Well, yes and no. It can be profitable if done professionally in the right areas and you've got the right sort of tenants. However, there are still many other opportunities in property to make money in property without necessarily doing buy-to-let. There's lots of different ways without having to have mortgages and large deposits. There's lots of strategies. So if you're interested in that, just drop me a line. And there's lots of courses that you can do where you can make money in property without even having your own money and without having large deposits. There's many, many strategies. And have a look at my website, moneytipsdaily.com, and if you're interested in any courses and everything, just drop me a line at charles@charleskelly.net. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Dagmar there out in Norway. Great to see you. I was watching a program about railways, coastal railways, on I think the BBC the other day, and this guy was going up a railway that goes from the south of Norway right into the Arctic Circle, and it really looks an amazing railway, and you end up in the Arctic Circle with this different colour sky and this blue sky and amazing scenes of calm seas. It looks really spectacular. That's definitely going on my bucket list. This train ride that you can do up the coast into the Arctic Circle. Maybe I can put it in my. I don't know if I can find it here. Have you ever seen this book? It might be back to front where you're watching, called The 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. Now, of course, in reality, you can't possibly see 1,000 places before you die. If you went on 5 holidays a year over 40 years, what's that, a couple of hundred places, and nobody has 5 holidays a year. You might have 1 holiday a year, and one main holiday a year. So how the hell can you see 1,000 places? But it's an interesting book, and maybe I'll look up this place in Norway. But perhaps you've got to say to yourself, look, I'm never going to be able to visit 1,000 places, even if I go on a world tour. But anyway, it looks spectacular. I'm sure you know this place, Dagmar, this rail line, but I must do that. And thanks to John Dale for watching. Great to see you. We were talking about Milton Keynes. I believe you used to run the Milton Keynes Filipino Festival. Is that right? That we used to run many years ago when we were recruiting nurses to come and work here in the UK. And I've got many cousins in Milton Keynes. They love it there. They moved out from London in the 70s. They think it's a wonderful place, and it has many qualities. It's a good place. So thanks for tuning in. I always welcome your comments on Facebook Live. Tick the like button if you like what I'm saying, and you can also catch me up on my website and on YouTube. Thanks a lot, and have a great evening. Bye for now.